Welcome everyone. I want to talk in this workshop particularly why we need to normalize incremental development and what role that has to play in helping us break out of the housing trap. On behalf of the Strong Towns organization, the work that we are doing is to address the fact that the prevailing pattern of development that we've inherited in our places is making our cities and towns weak and fragile. And so with the courage of advocates, we are seeking to change that. But I would love to hear for this room, hold up a hand in terms of 5 being I've read the Strong Towns books, I'm really interested in Strong Towns, to 1, I've never heard of Strong Towns before. Where are you on that spectrum? So hold up your hand 1 to 5, sort of generally. We got a bunch of 1s, a few 3s, a few 3s, a few more. Awesome. All right, we got a 5 back there. Very good. We'll chat afterwards. And so I'm glad that this is an opportunity to introduce you also to the effort that we are making across communities all across the North American landscape and in other parts of the world as well, to really grapple with the things that we have done to our places. Tomorrow, I'll go over it in more detail in terms of how we've made our places weak and fragile, but want to talk particularly about the housing trap that we are in. To solve the housing crisis, what direction do housing prices need to go? Who votes up? Put up your left hand. And who votes down to put up your right hand? All right, so we got a bunch of lefts. How many of you own a home? Do you want the house price to go up or down? So you want it to go up, right? And if you are out of a house, or if you're a renter like me, with expectations one day of being able to purchase, you want it to go down. And we can see it's an even split. And this is the conundrum that we find ourselves in. And this is one of the things from a Strong Towns perspective, as well as the work that many of you are doing on the affordable housing side, on the community-led development side, on the good people trying to do good things to help other good people in their community. We are grappling with this deeply. There are so many incentives for housing prices to continue to go up. So many people benefit when housing prices increase. The state gets more taxes as a consequence. Realtors do just fine on their commissions. Property owners rely upon that value. Their nest egg, especially for seniors that are in financially precarious positions otherwise. And so there's all of these major forces, and the only 2 significant forces asking for it to go down are those that are renting and those that are especially poor, those who are especially vulnerable. Which means that on the one side you have almost a large elephant, and on the other side you have a little mouse. But the thing is, the mice have found pitchforks. The thing is, the mice are learning to organize, and the mice at times become very angry and very frustrated, in part because of the conditions that we find ourselves in. It also leads, I don't want to downplay the real human harm, the challenge, the cost to the community of homelessness, of people struggling to make rent payments, all of the challenges that we face. And so in the Strong Town, housing emerges, we would say, as a principle and as our goal. It needs to emerge rapidly in response to local need. Rapidly in response to local need. Now, this is obviously an ambition and not currently the situation that we find ourselves in. Because in most places, people can't find homes they can afford to live in. And local builders say, I would love to do what you're asking me to do, but I can't afford to help you in the way that you're asking. I can't immediately move somebody in who's going to pay me 20% of market rate rents. I can't cash flow a project in the way that people are expecting me to cash flow a project, so therefore I have to sit on my hands and watch as the problem worsens. We've watched as this housing problem has worsened in our communities. And that's where our core response to the expectation of housing to grow rapidly in response to local needs is to say that we need to allow the next increment of development by right across North America. And what that looks like is a duplex that's allowed to become a fourplex when its life cycle is being updated, when it's next ready for sort of a natural point of revitalization, that it is by right you have the option to add additional units, to make home for more people. It looks like a single detached house that is just by right allowed to be developed further. But it also looks like smaller apartment buildings that in the course of time, when they are ready to be redeveloped, are allowed to have additional units added to them. Even my local housing authority, they did a giant renovation of their existing housing properties. And they had the ability in that location to actually add square footage, but they could not do so from the perspective of the city. They were capped by their zoning requirements. They were capped by the property sort of standards that our community had set in place. And so even at that most opportune time, when all of the construction and drywall dust was already present, we were adding no new net housing. And that was on the side of a nonprofit housing authority, let alone on the side of the for-profit participants. Now, this is a graph that, or a chart that you'd be familiar with. The changing demographics of our household sizes have a direct relevance upon this question. Not only the one that we often focus on is the size of our newer single-family homes and the reality that they're often oversized or sized for these purposes, but that change in household composition means we need a catch-up. If we have smaller families but more population, it means we need way more houses than even if we were to have maintained a static 3.8 people per house. We'd be able to house more people in single homes. Perhaps you've heard it said in the United States, you don't have a housing shortage. You don't have a bedroom shortage, you have a housing shortage. And there's certainly recognition in that. But there was a great podcast episode recently on the Missing Middle podcast that talked about the fact that the planning profession's major mistake in the last 40 years was the assumption that people would move out of their existing homes into the next smaller homes that were available for them. And when the seniors in particular decided to stay, it jammed the gears. It began to disrupt the assumptions that there would always be this fresh cycle of single family homes for the average person. But the challenge that we have also as we look at this, and this is part of the housing trap, this is part of the, do we want house prices to climb because it's good for us? Or do we want house prices to go down because it's good for us? In that context, I would probe the question, that increase in size from 983 to 2,500 square feet per single family home, is that because people's shelter need fundamentally changed? Do you simply, as a 21st century occupant of a home, need more space? It's possible, but unlikely, right? It's not that fundamentally something about us as humans has changed. And so in this context, what we can see though, is that if you ask your realtor, should I let my home, if I'm doing a new build, be 983 square feet or 25? They're gonna say 25 because you can sell it for more. Your bank, my sister had to actively tell her mortgage lender, no, I know that I qualify to be able to buy a larger home, but I'm not going to. On our income, we know what we qualify for, but we don't want to max that out. And yet from an investment status, that's what you should do as you get in at the ground floor. And so our challenge is that the stock of smaller or starter home construction has plummeted. Homes that are less than 1,400 square feet, which again is still a substantial home size, have plummeted over the years, 1973 to 2021. And out of that, at Strong Towns, when we talk about the next increment of development being allowed by right, sometimes people will spook because they're like, well, in the city of San Francisco, you have 20-story towers, and are you saying that the next increment would be a 25 or a 30-story tower? I'm like, let San Francisco just do what it needs to do. We are talking in South Dakota, in Aberdeen or Watertown or any number of other places, where when we talk about the next increment of development, it is actually just the backyard cottage. The next increment is allowing the reconversion of an existing home to be 2 units at limited cost, at limited burden to the community. And this is where our focus is, because this is actually housing that is trap-proof. I'll cite that because in the city of Edmonton, we had, there's a city council member, she's a Strong Towns advocate in her community and now sitting on council. She did a master's study of all of the garden suites or backyard cottages constructed in Edmonton under a pilot project that they were doing. And the question was, who rents from you? How much do you charge them? And how many vehicles do they have? In terms of who rented those backyard units, the vast majority were family members. In terms of how much do you charge them, over 50% of those units were well below market rate or free. And that third question, which is a secondary question for another discussion, how many vehicles do they have? Over 50% in the city of Edmonton, which is just as cold as South Dakota, didn't have a vehicle. And the result of that is that it was a recognition within our existing markets, we actually have a lot of housing supply where people are willing to leave money on the table, as in they're not gonna maximize profit, but they're gonna do things to provide for the ability to meet a core need of providing housing. And they were doing so as private citizens, meaning they could take some of the burden off of public authorities, some of the burden off of nonprofit organizations. This is what we mean about creating the conditions at minimum to make these things more trap-proof. So that yes, the individual that says, I'm thinking about a place for my mother-in-law, doesn't have to say, but it's probably not going to be worth it because the process is going to be way too much for us to go through. Because one of the realities that we face in our community is that when a home is ready to be sold and a new property is, or new buyers are ready to come in, we sometimes think that the house is the product. But the reality is it's the mortgage increasingly in our financial system that has become the product. This was the lead up to the 2008 financial crisis. It didn't matter what was being bought, just so long as more paper was being created to basically keep the system flush. Closing fees, sales fees, all of those different types of things. The banks basically getting paid a portion of funds in order to close each new mortgage because of the assurance that the federal government, through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac in the United States, the Canada Mortgage Housing Corporation in Canada, the federal governments were backstopping these mortgages. So it isn't even that there was a real risk to each lender. They just had to close the deal and move on to the next one until finally the failure to repay began to loom large. And yet even in that condition, the effort was still being made to roll mortgages rather than to really give thought to what about 900 square foot homes? What about 800 square foot units that people can call home? And one of the things that we've done that has created the conditions for the trap that we're in is that many of our efforts, and again, I'm going to be careful because South Dakota Housing Authority is providing various tools to help people get into homes. But we would say we need to be ever so careful about things that juice the demand side without addressing the supply side. And when we make it easier for more people to borrow more money, to pay more for housing, that is not the answer unless it is in your interest to have a runaway housing market. Making it easier for more people to borrow more, to get into homes feels at first glance as something that's righteous, as good. But we would say we need to add the caveat. We need to be ever so careful that we have not simultaneously constricted the ability of a housing market to provide for homes and then turned around and said, now that we made it so difficult to buy a home, we will just lend you more and maybe preferable interest rates, so that way you can then pay for that housing supply that we've constricted. This is the challenge that we face, especially in our places. We also point out the fact that in our current system, both of these actually are just financial products. You can go onto Wall Street or go to any of the real estate investment trusts. They know exactly how to cash flow and bankroll a large single detached housing development. A while ago, I flew into Fargo, and you can see these blocks, the leapfrog developments. Those are easy to cash flow. They're big dollars. There's some risk, but it's a known product. And in growing cities, we're also seeing the 5/1s as another type of new entrant into the market that's a very defined product. There's money for this. And so if we were to say, where's the distribution of investment capital for housing? Where's money being allowed and enabled to get to work? It's easy for that money to find its way into these types of projects. It's also easy for its money to find its way into these types of projects. You can go onto Robinhood or any of the number of stock trading apps and actually buy into companies whose project is to basically build either those or those. And where we think of the distribution of investment capital for luxury housing, there's a lot less investment capital available for it, but I'm pretty sure they're going to be fine. I'm pretty sure they're all right. But the part of the market that is not well served is around starter homes, is around small-scale residential development, is around small-scale townhomes, backyard cottages, the types of tools that are maybe a little bit messier and yet are essential to help us get out of that gap. There's this great chart. I can't remember the calculated risk blog, but it's tracking from Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. New home sales by price, just tracking the fact that, as you can see, basically the extinction of the starter home has become very clear. I'm just over 40. My brothers are 50. They just hit the 50-year mark. They were able to buy starter homes for $100,000. I don't have that option. And most of our generation that's following is saying that like to qualify now is significantly more expensive, even when we adjust for inflation as we go along. I had a conversation with a city council member, and she said, perhaps you've heard this before. She said, well, we were careful, and we saved, and we bought a house for $40,000. And I said, ma'am, was your household income $4,000 at that time? And she said, well, no, like together we made more than that. I said, then it's not equivalent to us right now, where we face an income to house cost in my community of 10 to 1. Some places it's even harder than that. And that means annual income put towards housing would take you 10 years to have covered the cost of your home. And this is the challenge. Those conditions have changed, and we need to create the conditions, especially if we're not building any more of these anymore. It means it's even less likely that this is going to be available. And part of the evidence of that is we had a project in our community, a larger residential area that was being developed. They actually built what they called artists' cottages. Single parking space at the back, fairly modest, almost like that, backing onto a little courtyard, lovely little homes. They're like, these are going to be the affordable ones. But there's such a scarcity that they were immediately, the prices were jumping. Even the resales were significantly more than what people initially bought them for. We say at Strong Towns, this is a self-imposed scarcity of nice things. We've created this condition for ourselves. And so, again, as you look, I was chatting with a planner in Watertown, saying, what is it in your zoning bylaws, in your current conditions that you set before builders that say, all who pass through these doors must abide by these rules? That co-owners, we as participants in our community, we sort of collectively either shrug and accept or actively accept these as our standards. What are those standards actually allowing? And is there any way for us to begin to loosen, or we would say to permit rather than require, a greater degree of freedom? To create the conditions for a minimum amount of regulatory friction to increase housing density by one increment. There should be approval to build to the next increment. And this is, we would also say you should have in place a way to seek permission to skip increments, to move up significantly up the ladder of intensity. But we already have a process for that, right? Our current zoning systems have this whole process of go and bow and genuflect before the planning commission, go and pray to the gods and drop off the fees and do all of those things, convince the neighbors not to show up at council, do any number of things. We can have that for the big leaps. But right now, everything that we apply out of fear about what the big leap might do to our community is the thing that throttles the small, simple project that we're not allowing through. And so what are trapper levers? And again, your community is beginning to allow that. South Dakota, if I understand the legislation correctly, it is possible to have up to 4 units on a single lot. That is a huge step forward. That is a seismic shift that is occurring. But those types of accessory apartments, knocking into existing homes additional capacity rather than having to build it new. Backyard cottages. We always say, in the language of planners, we call them accessory dwelling units or ADUs. I would say ADUs makes me think it might be a sexually transmitted disease. We're actually just saying it's a backyard cottages. In San Antonio, they are casitas. In LA as well. In my community, we call them coach houses. And I actually think there's real value in that. It's about helping everyone in the community see something for what it truly is. It is a cottage, a coach house. Honey, I bought a coach house sounds a lot better than honey, I think I might put a bid on an ADU. And so we need to move away from language that is especially critical or abstract, or clinical rather, and help ourselves. And so we need to reclaim that starter homes should be discrete, small structures, often with shared walls in order to increase efficiency. That should give us the opportunity to do this, because most affordable housing isn't new construction. Lower cost housing is created through small code compliant improvements to existing homes and buildings. We see this throughout human history. If you had an uncle move in with you 100 years ago, you would build them either you would build a little structure for them, or you would add on to your home. You would do other things in order to have additional capacity. And these types of incremental changes add homes or increase usability without requiring large-scale new construction. This is the same calculation that we use for cars and phones and storefronts, isn't it? We actually have this challenge that we think affordable housing has to be new housing, new construction. And yet, one of the things that we recognize as we look at the supply of available housing in our community, that graph of the shortage of starter homes or homes at a sales price below $150,000, the reality that we face is that we actually need much of that supply to be met through existing structures that are modified to meet new needs. And so at Strongtown's, one of our core principles, I always find half the room agrees with me on one side, and then the other half is like, oh, I agree with the other part. And this is where we believe there's really a powerful way to bring this together. No neighborhood should be subject to radical change. If you left your neighborhood, came back 10 years from now, you should still recognize it. And part of our current housing policy actually makes that really difficult because we basically designate certain areas to be upzoned radically, and next thing you know, they're substantially altered. But you also can't exempt the same neighborhood from change. And part of the way in which we try to help people with this, because some folks say, my area, they're like, I bought in this neighborhood because I don't want it to change. So my entrance was supposed to be the last entrant of a newcomer, and then we pulled up the drawbridge because we don't want anything else to change. Please, and ironically, they will have been somebody that did a renovation on their house to be move-in ready for them, and then they're like, but now no more, right? The challenge is, that can only take you so far. And we'll go into the details of this in more detail, more specifics tomorrow. But one of the ways in which as community leaders we can help to lead this conversation is to talk about what kind of community we expect to live in. You can think about the housing and infrastructure needs of lot sizes that are pretty normal in the Midwest, pretty normal across the North American landscape. You have 2.9 units per acre in a space like this. And so this is Atlanta numbers, but this would be 1.35 million an acre. And when we currently in our system enable just more of the same, we're starting to move around the margins, around backyard cottages, around some of the other efforts that are being made on this front. But generally what people are expecting is just more of the same. But the challenge is there's a lot of costs to keep up when you have a fairly low density. And so this is normal, but I think it's helpful, and I'll be happy to share the slides afterwards, to be able to share in your community when we talk about having high quality services and low taxes. That's a noble goal, and there's actually a way to do that. But it won't look like this, because when you add the sidewalks, the curbs, the poles, the trees, the street lights, the traffic lights, the storm, the water, the sewer, the paving, and then we get trash and schools and fire, when we begin to add all of those things in, one of the things that we see is that single family only housing requires a significant amount of infrastructure per unit, but with very little tax revenue to pay for it. There was a reason that on the prairies, we didn't grow apples. Because on our farm, if we had planted apple trees, we would have gotten little crab apples that taste just as good as some of you remember, and there would not have been that many of them. It would have been a nightmare to try to deal with them. We'd have to find ways to water them. We'd have to do all of that sort of stuff. And then the resulting return to our farm would be really low. Instead, we grew alfalfa. Why couldn't we take on a project that was going to require a lot more upfront investment? And yes, there might be a payoff down the road because what we had couldn't justify that amount of labor for the amount of output that we would get. And this creates the conditions that Strongtown says have made our places so weak and fragile, because we said, let's just do it anyways. Let's just do it anyways. And we created the conditions in which a significant number of people don't have a place to live, and are fighting at the margins, and are fighting with each other, and are burdened because we've not made provision for them. And so this is a little bit of like, go from, a couple of homes to just fill up the entire block. Most of our places are not actually going to see this. Minneapolis said, hey, we're going to allow a slight intensification of our lots citywide. And in Minneapolis, the uptake over 10 years has been slow but significant. As in, it was not a sudden onslaught of all kinds of redevelopment, every block being torn up, which is what the critics asserted would happen. There'd be a land rush and everybody would be, no one would recognize their neighborhood. It's not going to immediately look like this. But you can gradually thicken up a neighborhood. You can gradually permit, not require. A lot of people are getting spooked because they see that the end of single-family zoning is now the declaration, you must put a backyard cottage, you must live cheek to jowl with your neighbors. That's not the case. But in a community and in a country defined by pursuit of individual happiness, by property rights, by all of these things, it's stunning the level of control that we exercise over a neighbor's property. And we can do so in the name of the Commonwealth, but if the Commonwealth is not being well served, then maybe we need to reconsider. And so you can increase that total value of that area, that cluster significantly, especially when you begin to layer in things that our communities need. I love the Homer Simpson Plaza where you can get his ice cream, his burgers, his beer, and his pizza, including this within our existing neighborhoods. This is allowing for that gradual adaptation of our places to be able to cover the costs of our service needs as we continue to thicken up our community. I'll go in this tomorrow, but this was the city of Kansas City. Population increase. So you've got more people, which means there's more pockets to draw from to be able to cover the cost of services. But the change in development pattern that occurred between 1910 and 2010, the spreading out of the community rather than the thickening up of the community, which would be represented in sort of the normal progression of neighborhoods thickening up. We are at Kansas City. The numbers speak to the real challenge that our communities loaded themselves up with. And this is where the irony, so this is Kansas City, this is also South Bend, Indiana, where they had a population decline, but in that time saw a significant increase in the amount of obligations that they were taking on in order to service the land that they had further developed. Because the population of South Bend from 1960 onwards kept growing until it began to decline rapidly, which is something all of our communities should expect to happen at various times, especially if you live in more rural areas. But in this context, South Bend made a doubly disastrous choice. One, they found that their over-reliance on core industries, the Packard plant, for example, in South Bend, meant that their assumption of shiny days ahead was giving rise to a development pattern that was proving to be unsustainable even in the good years. But then when the bad years came, they made a fateful discovery, which is that now they had inherited way more infrastructure requirements than they could manage. Now, South Bend is turning that story around. And the way in which they are doing that, I would encourage you, if you are in the housing sector, check out what they are doing in terms of pre-approved building plans. Check out what they are doing in terms of cultivating a small-scale local developer cohort. They have over 100 people that are all taking on projects that are either their first, second, or third project. They're renovating existing homes. They are doing the work, except for the Homer Simpson Plaza, they are doing the work of reintroducing housing into places where it's been stripped away or where it was never built because of the assumption we can keep growing as long as we want. In that context, they have found ways to find additional participants to pay for the core services that they need as a community to begin to recover from the huge infrastructure obligation that they have. But this is the challenge that we face in our places, is that there's this complexity conundrum that will be very familiar with you if you've tried to move any projects forward in most of our communities. You can get away with large multifamily. That's going to take years or sometimes a decade to go through. You're going to probably see defeat at a city council hearing several times along the way, but your returns are going to be significant enough that you can sort of hold on for long enough that you'll make it. If you have a large enough ship, you can plow through the icebergs, as not the Titanic, as other ships have found. But if you're in a dinghy and you are trying to do something else, you're going to struggle. Single family, like I said, there's money for it. We've also made it possible for new single family homes to be constructed relatively easily. The costs keep climbing, the input costs keep going up. The building standards and what our building code expects continues to increase, and those pose some challenges. But anything in that middle is often a low return with significant high expense and a high amount of brain damage. That's that incremental infill. I also joke that infill sounds like something you get at the dentist. Infill is actually just neighborhood investment. It's investing in our existing neighborhoods, in our places where we know already that housing is proven to be viable. And it's in connection to nearby services. It's connected to nearby schools, to other significant public investments that we have made. So why shouldn't we be doing incremental infill in these places? And so that's where we say the next increment should be allowed, and our zoning bylaws can be updated to do this. In my province, in British Columbia, we are now allowed to build up to 4 units on each lot across the province, and it's been interesting because the doom and gloomers said, oh, there goes the neighborhood. When in fact, it's just been discrete projects in certain little areas. You're seeing not even pockets of development, but lot, and then another lot. It's like a checkerboard, but only a few pieces so far have been put on the board. But it is significant because I'm hearing the stories of families being reunited. Grandma was living in another city. Now she gets to live with us. You're hearing about kids that are actually able to get off their parents' couch and sleep on their own couch. It just happens to still be in the backyard. You're seeing lots of opportunities for people to increasingly meet their needs through these types of projects. From a strong towns critique, though, we would say that there's still this desire to hold on to absolute control for years to come by saying, we know what the new number should be, it's 4. We know what that new number should be, it's 4. So once we hit the threshold where more than 4 is required, as some of our cities are finding, there's still a battle, there's still a burden, there's still a problem. And what is it about us that we say, right now, we're going to allow you to do a little, but down the road, when you're ready to do more, we're going to stand in your way then? What about if we create the pathways, and we can do this already in our zoning standards with more adaptive codes that allow for this to occur, in part because one of my favorite sayings is that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior unless you make a significant change. This is Grand Rapids, Michigan, but this could be many other places across the North American landscape. As the community was thickening up, they had land for days. They had the rest of Michigan to build in. But for some reason, and we know the reasons, and I'll go into it in more detail tomorrow, for some reason, they built a lot of things together. Because that's how you create economic opportunity. That's how you create the conditions for more people to play more of a role in building a strong community. And you can see the lot coverage, the complexity of the buildings. I mentioned the space for the uncle. If you've got an uncle that snores, you build him a little section there. And some of our standards of, oh, is that an inhabitable building? I'm like, honor the fire code, make sure it's not a death trap, but generally we can get away with a lot of this in part because we can anticipate as we visit cities around the world that these neighborhoods still function well. These places, in fact, many of our best areas in some of our great cities, if they were to burn down today, we could not rebuild them in the same way tomorrow. That's an indicator that maybe we've messed up. At Strong Towns, we say that's our self-imposed scarcity of nice places. And so, I'm just 2:09. Okay, I've got a bit of time. This is more theory, so I'm going to move on. This is a great slide. Leon Cryer, if you've ever come across his work, is fascinating, but I won't go into that too much. I love and I hate this slide because it's like stating the obvious. We need to lower the bar of entry. But what I mean by lowering the bar of entry can't look like this, which is what my city has basically enabled. They've said, well, you can take the entire block, you just have to convince all the owners to sell, put them under great duress, then moonscape that lot, and leave it as is for about 5 years before you get the financing in place to be able to develop it, and then go and build additional housing. And there's a side on the supply side where you're like, look, lots of new homes. But that is a significant change for that neighborhood. And it's represented a significant period of time in which all of the construction activity is going on. The sense that the very few occupants that we're seeing here had no option to simply move into an adjacent building as it was developed. And so one of the exercises, perhaps the scale is different in your community. One of the things that our parking standards have created for ourselves is the obligation to do this kind of project rather than allowing for dozens of different owners to independently at different start times begin projects on their own property. And you can gain the same amount of housing in this type of infill pattern, this type of investing in existing neighborhoods without the dramatic change to the entire neighborhood. You can begin to really respect local features and even character. Yes, I'll say we should respect local character. It's how we become familiar with our place and appreciate it. In that context, we shouldn't require assembly as the precondition for any kind of project. And again, from a Strong Towns perspective, we're not saying never do land assembly. Sometimes it is required. But the fact that that is almost always the only thing that we are seeing until, as in our province, for example, when all of a sudden they said you're allowed to do up to 4 units per lot, the realization was, oh, people are actually willing to do that. Now, you'll appreciate this if you are involved in housing policy at all. My city planner, I had a conversation with him. His daughter was riding her bike and my son was playing baseball with some friends. And he said, yeah, but Norm, if we allow, so right now you have to own the whole lot, and then you can have 3 additional units that you can rent out. And I said, why can't we have 4 different people buy one of those units, and then basically you have dropped the purchase price, so that way you have 4 participants. He said, well, but then what would happen is that, say these were the 1 lot that was turned into 4. Then, ostensibly, once you had built it, you could then subdivide that because you had full ownership, so then you could do 4 more. And then down the road, you could then do 4. I said, let them. Because the trouble was this idea that they were trying to say the end goal, the worst possible scenario is that we have 1 lot subdivided into 32. 1, that's not feasible. There's still height limits, there's still setback requirements, there's things like that. But also 2, why are you standing in the way of a path to home ownership that takes a single lot and splits it 4 ways? Creates the conditions for many more people to move from. I was chatting with Brett from Aberdeen Housing Authority. He said one of his challenges, I think I can share this on his behalf. Brett, if you're watching this afterwards, I can take it down if you need me to. He said one of the challenges we have is folks are using the properties of the Housing Authority as their forever home, because there's no pathway for them to move into something else for them. There's no pathway, or a very limited pathway, for them to have the opportunity to buy into a project like this, to be able to be involved in building that project. One of my avatars of a healthy community is a drywall person that hangs drywall all week, and then she, with a bunch of friends, builds an additional home in the backyard on the weekends. That's what my dad did. We had a dairy farm, and we knocked down our existing old CP rail home. We lived in a mobile home for a while that we brought on site, and my dad, with a friend, built the home that we lived in. That was normal. And one of the challenges that we have is that we're at risk of severely professionalizing our building industries. And that feels like the right thing. Who doesn't want professional chefs? Who doesn't want professional surgeons? And who doesn't want professional builders? And there is a market for them. But we also need home-baked goods. We also need people putting on Band-Aids. We also need people building backyard structures for their family members. We also need this on the commercial side. This is a little bit of an add-on. We needed to lower the bar of entry. Muskegon, Michigan is a huge favorite of ours, because in Muskegon what they did is they just took simple storage sheds. I think these were purchased for $8,000 a piece. They bought 12 of them up front. And they said anybody can move in here if they have a business project underway. They use the adjacent part of a city-owned parking lot. Because they're downtown, nobody could afford to live in the downtown. No one could afford to rent a shop in the downtown at the going rates. And the landlords were like, look, I've got a large space. I can't rent it for any cheaper. So they were at an impasse. They had these home-based businesses that couldn't move to that next level. So they said, all right, we'll put these in place. And within a short amount of time, what was also cool about it is they paired everybody up. I think it was $800 for the summer, and you got paired up with a small business advisor. Every one of the initial applicants moved into downtown stores once they proved that they had the capacity. Every one of them had the opportunity to get started and then took it further. And I believe that this is what we can see in a lot of our places as now. This neighbor talks to this neighbor and says, not, hey, did that realtor drop by yesterday and give you an updated offer? But instead, this neighbor says to that neighbor, hey, if I help you, can you help me? That's the difference. That to me is what built the prairies. That to me is how we see so much of this effort being wasted by making it impossible for this to happen, or really difficult. And so in many cities and towns, most development activity, and check your own community, I'm sure this happens here, is just in concentrated pockets with other areas that are overlooked or off limits. And that's a real burden. That is going to catch up to us. That's the challenge that, as I said in the earlier description of all of the infrastructure costs of our current pattern of development, those costs are coming due. And so out of this then, if we want more entry-level housing, we need more incremental developers. People that build in those first-level increments. We have the professional builders, we have the well-entrenched contractors. I actually had a contractor from Wisconsin reached out and he said, Norm, he left a message actually, and the message from our receptionist service was, is Strong Towns a cult? I was like, all right, I gotta return this call. This is either somebody that's really upset with us or really off track. And he said, is Strong Towns a cult? Because he said, I've been a builder in Wisconsin for decades, and I'm retired now. And we used to build simple, modest structures for our community members. We used to build farm additions that were fairly simple, but they were necessary, a little storage shed or a little feed outlay, whatever that looked like. But he said, I did the same thing for my city. I would build little structures next to the sewage plant, whatever was needed. And I knew where the money came from, and I knew why we were doing it. He said, my son took over my business, and all of his projects are big, in the middle of two-bit, Wisconsin. And he said, and none of the money is actually local. There might be a tiny little bit of matching money, but most of it is state and federal money. He said, we're doing all these big projects, but who's going to cover these costs? And his contention, he said, we've lost sight of what it takes to build lasting prosperity. And he started listening to Strong Towns podcasts and content, and he said, either we have collectively lost our mind and we're in a cult together, or we're actually onto something that we've lost sight of what it takes to build lasting prosperity. And that means having many different levels of which you can participate in this process. And if we want more incremental developers, if we want to strengthen our communities from within, we need to make it easier for them to say yes. And that's how the city can help. Quickly here, we did a series of roundtables with small-scale developers all across the nation and some in Canada as well. They're not asking for handouts. They're just saying, look, when we we're not hitting even a single wall that we can simply name and say, like, if we just got rid of one thing, they're hitting a tangle of policies, a tangle of restrictions, a tangle of delays, a tangle of fake assurances. They're not asking, they're asking for a fair shot, even when the rules technically allow it. As in my city, something keeps them from getting started. I kept having to redesign because I asked the wrong question the first time. Is often for a first-time builder, a first-time project lead can be huge. That it is legal on paper, but then all of a sudden it turns out there's this extra addendum that requires them to do something that they had no understanding that would be required. That's in Omaha. How about in Lafayette? Everyone was friendly, but I never got the same answer twice. That is a thing that we can resolve. I was chatting with the mayor of Bellingham, Washington. And again, if you're in city planning, I shared this with my friend Ashton a moment ago. In Bellingham, Washington, the mayor said, every time I ask, can we get everybody on the same page? And if there's a problem, can we just fix that problem? And he said, well, our comprehensive code review hasn't been done in 10 years. And so we need to hire consultants. We need to go through this long, extended process to correct our code. And she said, but if we got it right once, which we didn't, but imagine that we got the comprehensive code correct once, and then we wait every 15 years to fix it, and we can see all the problems that we have, what if we just began to change it? And I said, well, that's what Kalamazoo, Michigan is doing. Kalamazoo, almost every 2 weeks when council meets, they are adjusting another part of their zoning bylaw to more properly perform the way that it should, to make it possible so that there's never the moment that you get two different answers. That the code aligns, and if there's a mismatch, you fix it rather than sticking it on a to-do list and waiting for a consultant to come take care of it. And this is actually within our power. It's actually more empowering, isn't it? Because then what we can do is if we have granted the same variance twice or 3 times in our place, or we've had something go to the board of variance several times, we say, all right, let's make sure we never have to deal with that again by letting the process update the records as we go. I knew what I wanted to build. I just didn't believe that the city wanted me to build it. Is another challenge that a lot of our places have. Are we communicating as civic leaders the value of this? I'll say here, I'll put on my pastor's hat. I could talk for days about the moral responsibility that we have to love our neighbor, and that loving our neighbor means providing them with a place to live. Trouble is, I will lose the room. Maybe not this room. I believe you. But many rooms, they're like, I hear you, but that seems like a trap. You're doing that moralist thing with me. So I'm like, all right, I got to talk to you about the performance of our place from a financial perspective. I need to talk to you about the fact that our firefighters can't afford to live in our community, or the fact that retirees are not finding anything suitable for them to live in. Let's get to the nuts and bolts of those things. We can talk about how we feel, but we also need to talk about how our places perform. And if they're underperforming or struggling, let's do what's necessary on that front. And so this can be that process of communicating clearly. What do we want? One city in Maine, in the state of Maine, one of the cool things that they did is they took pictures of existing homes in their community that were mixed, that had either a duplex, a triplex. Most of them were built before zoning bylaws were introduced. These were lovely spots. Some of them were Airbnbs, some of them were the home of the mayor. There are lots of different types of homes. And then they just printed them and put posters on the wall as you walked up to either to get your mail, as well as, because it was a smaller community, as you went to go get your permits. Demonstrating, we want more of this. We want to see this. And when you begin to do that, you create the culture where complexity is beginning to be addressed, but also that deep sense of uncertainty or mistrust is actually being resolved over time. And so at Strong Towns, we do have several toolkits. The core one that I would encourage, that I think you would find a lot of overlap with, probably to find allies in your work, if you're a public authority, to be able to work with locals in your community. To be able to do that work, we sometimes do this side where it's like you're either a for-profit developer or you're a nonprofit developer. I'm like, even the nonprofit developers have to make the projects pencil. And even the for-profit developers are not simply saying, how do I squeeze the last bit of orange out of this or juice out of this orange? We see people willing to leave some money on the table, but they can't lose their shirt. And this is the challenge that we face in our places as we think through. And we have great partners. The Incremental Development Alliance is another great asset. They will come do boot shops, or boot camps and workshops, or boot shops, in your community to just say, if you have any kind of an inkling, if you're that drywall hanger all week and you want to get a project started on the side, we will coach you. Another organization, Neighborhood Evolution, has a 12-step program. Not for recovering alcoholics, but for aspiring developers who probably at times feel like they're both facing the most insurmountable walls. And yet the Incremental Developer Network, they say, how do we build capacity together? We put out a simple test. We had communities all across North America say, we are housing ready. We're starting to meet more of these policies around housing ready requirements in our communities. I know I skipped that slide, but I'm coming back to it. Incremental developers are your allies. They matter significantly. They are much like if you walked into a swamp and all that you saw was green algae and you saw a bunch of tires and you didn't hear any birdsong, you know that something was wrong. You know, Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. I say this as a farm kid who was like told Rachel Carson was the devil. But in that context, if you don't hear the birds, probably something is wrong. If we don't see incremental developers, that first rung, providing first rung housing for many people, something is deeply wrong. They build wealth that stays in the neighborhood. You see this. Ask your local lumber companies who buys from you. It's not your big builders. And I understand why big builders don't support the local small stores, but the small ones sure do. They use infrastructure that already exists. They heal the gaps left behind. They expand housing opportunity in a way that fits the block, not disrupts it. One of our best examples of incremental development is in Fayetteville, Arkansas. And in Fayetteville, Arkansas, Allie Quinlan leads her company there. And she says, every project I do, I ask when I'm designing it, how do I make it cuter? She said, because cute sells. People want to live in nice places. And she said, and then people realize like whimsy and beautiful things actually inspire us. And oh, by the way, we can also afford to build this way. And so this is an example in Oregon of bringing together a workshop of people to say, how do we get started developing our own communities? I'll go through this fairly rapid fire, just knowing that our time is, oh yeah, I got 5 minutes. Allow single family home conversion. This already, we're starting to see this really take hold, but this is our core policy. You have to allow this by right and not stand in the way. Making it possible for backyard cottages to be one of those ways that you meet those requirements. Legalizing starter homes. If you still, I'm not sure how many of your communities have minimum house sizes or minimum lot size requirements. Those are not needed, I'll tell you. They're not needed and they're not helpful. The irony of many of our suburbs is that they are subdivisions that can no longer be subdivided. That's wild, isn't it? I mean, I grew up on a farm where we knew what it was to have some subdivisions pop up around us. But then for those subdivisions to now be locked in place in a county, in a rural setting, that makes sense. But in a city setting, that doesn't make sense at all. Why wouldn't we be allowing the thickening up of our neighborhoods in existing neighborhoods? Another very contentious item, but one that's essential, is repealing parking mandates. I looked it up. I believe this is right. Minnehaha County requires 2 additional off-street spaces for each accessory dwelling unit or each backyard cottage. That prohibits the vast majority of people that, for example, in Edmonton, a very cold place, that said, hey, what if we have somebody who doesn't have a vehicle? I want to set something up for them. I'm going to make this available to them. Instead, these types of requirements just double down on a pattern that is not working for our places. Rapid City, 2 off-street spaces for the main house plus 1 more for the ADU, meaning most of those projects don't actually work very well in that context. Even as we see more and more residential developments occur. There's one here in Omaha, or in Nebraska, where they just said 1 parking space per unit. And this is a lot more density than a lot of our communities have. Guess what? It's absolute terrible. It's just Armageddon. Nobody can ever get out. No, right? We know that this is actually very doable. We know that this can create the conditions for more people to say, I opt into a community like this. I want a place like this. My lifestyle can manage to work within these types of conditions. We actually can see this begin to really occur. So I'll have to come back for a parking talk. But, and then lastly, again, streamlining the approval process is about getting under the hood, saying, why is that there? What can we do to address that? Taking a note from cities like Kalamazoo and saying, let's incrementally adjust our codes as we go along to make them more permissive, more suitable to our current context, to make it simple to build to the next increment. We say, if with a 9th grade education, you should be allowed to come in at 9 o'clock and leave by noon with a building permit in hand. What would that do? It'll take money off the sidelines and put it into action in your community. It will teach people to get their start, and when you do this, it will help. Another key thing, I believe some of that work is happening in the Housing Authority around pre-approved building plans. Again, Kalamazoo has really led with this, South Bend, more and more places. They are actually not just giving you some suggested standards, sort of Sears catalog. They're basically saying if you buy the equivalent of a Sears catalog home, you can put it on any of our properties. Because we already know where the hookups are going to be. We already know the lot size that'll be required for it. And yes, even our fire chief has already signed off on it. There's no more approvals required. You go in almost like a Coke machine, except you say, I want a 2-bedroom unit with a secondary ensuite on the side, and you pull it out, you go and build it, and it's ready to go. And now your tax base is one step closer to being healthy. You've continued to help your community. So one of the things that we can do, actually, I think you saw the rest of my slides. So we're almost there. Muskegon, Michigan, they have taken the tools of tax increment financing. But they've done several important things. Actually, I'll share this. One of the things that they did is they said, all right, we as a city can provide some funding and support up front for contractor training. They basically were able to reallocate some of their building inspection fees to provide contractor support and training. They said because, yes, the fees are necessary, but those fees basically go to the people to tell them that they did it wrong. So why don't we take those people and tell those people how to do it right? And so one of the things that they found is that all of a sudden approval times as well as time to occupancy began to plummet. And they created the conditions in which now there was a virtuous cycle that, of course, the building officials knew by name more of the first-time builders, the third-time builders, the fifth-time builders. They were assisting them, and they were even learning from them, hey, I gotta tell you, when you show up on site and you say this, you're actually wrong. We've just put up with it for a while, hoping that you would sort of go away after a while. Instead, now they're creating collegial relationships. They're providing pre-development and technical assistance, but they've also been doing all sorts of things to reduce the land price based on affordability. This was providing city-owned land. Well, what they also did is they used tax increment financing, but they used it for the upfront purchase price for the property. So that if a home could be constructed for $100,000, the homeowner, who would be the new purchaser, now Muskegon prices are lower than here, but the new home purchaser would basically be able to buy the home at $80,000 and basically take out a TIF from the community, from the city, that over the course of the time their new property taxes that they were contributing to the system would be basically recouping that additional $20,000. And what they were doing then is that the builder was actually being properly paid out for what they had put into the project, and then a portion of that purchase price was being covered in the form of not just a loan or a forgivable loan, but instead a tax increment finance that said, on the amount of new property tax being added to the tax rolls here, that's what we recoup and we use that to borrow. Really clever, really carefully done. In Minnesota, they've done this where they've said low-level or entry-level units Bottom rung stuff is eligible for being used using our special assessment tools. Now, your mileage may vary on this depending on how regulated your state's rules around special assessments are, but I want to highlight the fact that what they said is we can finance these entry-level units much like if we repair your street and we assign each property owner a portion on their next property tax bills for the next 5 years of that special assessment being added to their tax bill. We can actually do that on a single lot rather than on the whole street just for that single unit being added. And the justification is this will help our place. When we add this for grandma, or when we add this for our brand new firefighter, or when we add this for the travel nurse that needs to come to our community to help us, that is a net benefit to the community, so it's a justifiable thing, much like repaving the street might have been. Arguably, repaving the street is a lower priority than making sure that our teacher has a place to live, or our new football coach, or ice hockey coach, there you go, within our community. Another one is in Florida. This one, again, mileage varies depending on what state will allow, but local governments can use their credit capacity to guarantee loans up to a certain amount to make housing small-scale investments viable. This one is, I'm cautious with this in part because it is reliant on the idea that most of the occupants of these new homes are going to be making their payments. And most of them then are going to be, even if the community has to absorb the cost of a bunch of defunct loans or loans going bad, most of them will be fine. But one of the things is that the community has significant borrowing capacity. And so in Florida communities, they started to lean into that for a portion of the purchase price up front. That one I'm less familiar with, but I know it's one that more places are trying to explore as they put this together. And so we've got the two toolkits right now on local code reform and building the housing ready city. We have a third coming out that is going to be much more extensive on financing local development. The biggest snag, and this would be familiar to each of you in the room, is that many of the standards vary not even state by state, but county by county. And so that is a really challenging one. And so at Strongtown's, part of our purpose is to say, how do we reorient ourselves to those sort of opening core principles? We need to allow the next increment of development by right. We need to make it possible that with a 9th grade education, you can walk in at 9 and leave by noon with a building permit in hand to do that next round of investment in your community. And tied into that, no neighborhood should be subject to radical change, but also no neighborhood should be exempt from change. And we'll talk more tomorrow in the opening keynote, or the morning keynote, on the long-term financial prospects for our place. Get ready for the language of the intergenerational dine and dash. We're ready, I'll be preparing for that. But along the way, one of the things that we grapple with is that we have done a lot of things to make it really hard to create things that we really need in our places. And so with that, I'd love to take questions from you. Thank you for the time, and yeah, even putting up some technical stuff. So we got more time than I thought. This is perfect. Questions, objections, rebuttals, complaints. So there's two approaches. One is top down. So a state passes rules, and that just happens across the state. So we've seen that in California or other places where all of a sudden, and that instigates a lot of fear. A lot of people just saying, like, I don't want that, or they assign a new narrative to it. Montana tried to do state level change, but they said it's very consciously, we are not being California, even though ironically the Montana legislature's changes were more radical than what California had done. But the key thing there was at the state level, they were saying we need to permit, we're not in the work of requiring. So that would be one of those things. The flip side is what's happening in, we have now almost 300 communities that have a local conversation group. And so from a Strongtown's perspective, what was really cool, Sioux Falls, actually, Jordan Diefenbaugh and several others in that community, they were interested in what Strongtown stuff was saying, and they just started meeting at a local coffee shop and talking about it. And increasingly, in another community, Bothell, Washington, similarly, they had a community member. He said, hey, I kind of don't mind some of the changes I'm seeing in the community. I'd like to see our community become stronger. If anybody else feels the same way, let's meet together. In both of their cases, they've had multiple people get elected to local council because the conversation has begun to shift as people that are at the local level are writing letters to the editor, showing up to public hearings, participating in the process. In my city, 5 years ago, I took note at a public hearing on removing some rental restrictions. We had a lot of restrictions on who was allowed to rent a secondary unit in their building. And I took note of everybody that spoke up in favor of removing those restrictions. And so I didn't immediately try to combat the lady that said that every renter's a criminal or on their way to becoming a criminal. I could have, but I didn't. I could have gone after the people that were like, well, but this is going to sabotage our property values, which it doesn't, but they were about to assert that it does without evidence. Instead, I said, I need to talk to the people that spoke up in favor. So we started meeting. We created Deltons for people-oriented places. And we, even there specifically, we didn't say strong towns in Delta. We said we're Deltons for people-oriented places. And during the last municipal election, what we did to help shift the conversation and to sort of open up the window for this is we put out a platform for the ideal candidate for Delta. And so that's what we call it. The ideal candidate for Delta will hold to these things. And it was 31 different items. And what was interesting is we didn't expect immediately all the candidates to walk in and be like, yes, I endorse it, and sort of swear a pledge, any of that sort of stuff. Canadians will swear a lot of things, but we won't swear to that. But what was cool is on the doorstep, candidates would say, they would be confronted by that person that says, I don't want any of the stuff that you guys are doing. Who's this even for? Nobody wants this. I talk to people at the pub and nobody wants this. And they would say, well, did you read the newspaper article? And they'd be like, well, what do you mean? Well, did you read about Del Pop? There's this whole group of young people that are advocating for trust me, way more than what I, as the wise candidate, now somewhere in that middle, represent. Because one of the dynamics that we face in our cities is that staff know what good or even better represents. Then staff know that council is going to want a version of it that is the least objectionable possible. So they present that as their staff report. Then the staff report, the council members say, oh boy, this is radical. So what about if we find the middle ground, and now that middle ground is do nothing, or even worse, actually let's roll this back. I didn't realize that was in the policy. We don't know what the unintended consequences. So now you've gone from staff knowing what better looks like, but having to put that on the shelf, to suddenly council being like, what staff have presented is too radical. And so we had council members whose whole mantra was, well, I'm the reasonable, let's meet in the middle person. So I said, all right, so our platform, informally, I called it the Jeannie Kanakis platform, because it was basically to pull Jeannie to our side a little bit more so that way she could reasonably say on the doorstep, I'm in the middle. And if we can begin to mold the conversation in that way, because I can come and share this and try to equip you to be able to have these conversations in your community, but there's no one that has been won over simply because they're like, well, an expert from a dairy farm kid from Alberta showed up and said that we should do things differently, and so yeah, we all agree. Everybody agrees. It happens locally, and so our big thing is one of the challenges. We've raised some hackles in the online world, which is easy to do. But by being very cautious about some of the state level efforts being used right now, a lot of preemption bills, we're very cautious about that because that can swing both ways. These are big hammers and they neutralize or neuter local engagement. And people then are saying, how many times have you heard a council member say, well, if the state requires us to do it, is there anything that we can do to not do this? I have a kid. I know that if I tell him one thing, he will sometimes be like, is there any way that I'm going to do the opposite because I don't want to do what I was just told to do? We engender those types of reactions. So it has to be, I would say it has to be bottom up, but we've had city staff that on the quiet are helping our group to better understand what's going on. So they're not official members of our group. They're like, hey, by the way, this project is coming forward. Can you just get a few people to show up? I've had council members that said, hey, this is the first time we've had more people speak up in favor than against what is going on there. And another third element, this is my brother, comes to mind in Alberta. He was like, Norm, there's this 15-minute cities thing. They want to put us all into shoe boxes and basically deprive us because they're dumping density down our throat. Can you believe it? I was like, well, Erwin, you live on a farm. That's not going to happen to you. And he said, yeah, but they're building a bike lane in my community. I said, that's okay. There's probably a few people that use it, right? And he said, well, but isn't that the part of this big conspiracy? I was like, Erwin, you can sit this fight out. And that actually is a little bit of a strong towns approach as well, which is most people are not going to tune in. They're going to care more if the Knicks win or whatever else is going on. And actually sometimes we can see this rapid mobilization, and especially if anyone is city staff or has worked for a nonprofit, you've presented a project, and next thing it's as if you've proposed a data center for your community. Or no, it's as if you proposed, nuclear Armageddon. And you're like, how did this get torqued out? And how is it that, 150 people are wearing t-shirts to oppose our project? And it's because a handful of them may have misunderstood or even willingly, deliberately misspoken about what it is. But many other people are like, well, that sounds bad. I think I'm against that. Am I against that? And much like my brother, I could talk him off the ledge and be like, the things that you're worried about are not what's being proposed here. Let's talk this through. Over time, that meant that he was like, oh, so I can go back to watching hockey? And I was like, yeah, it's okay. And so I think that is an element of chatting with Ashton as well, things like a comprehensive code reform run up into the realities of our public process, which is there can be one single clause that somebody objects to rightfully, and it can tank the whole thing. So why do we set ourselves up for that kind of failure by asking for not only our entire code to be hung up on by a single thing, but also if you've got, say one of those 5/1s, a large project being introduced, the first of its kind in the community. We have that process in place for that kind of project. But then somebody says, well, I want to do a triplex on my lot for me and my wife's family and my family. And we say, okay, you go through the same process. And then we wonder why we get the same outcome. So that's a big part of it. So it's got to be at the local level, and we have lots of training resources to help at the local level people figure out how to change the conversation. I was just in Sioux Falls last night giving a talk on property taxes and building local prosperity. We had local candidates that showed up because they're like, I want to be able to talk at the doorstep in a reasonable way about this. I was like, that's a culture shift that's already occurred there. There's an openness to these types of things, grappling with their financial future that really matters. And that can play a big role in helping our communities. We have to figure these things out. We certainly can. Check out the Strongtown's local conversations groups. If you're in a spot where you can't start one yourself, you probably know somebody that's either priced out or worried about what's happening, or just is open to some change and say, hey, check those things out. That's an opportunity for you. So the financing follows the proof. So first you need the proof. So Kalamazoo comes to mind. Their community foundation said, we need to build a few triplexes in our community so that the banks have a comp on the real estate assessment that they can now use. So if it is the first of its kind, although most of our downtowns, most of our traditionally built areas actually have either that odd triplex or that strange duplex, sometimes you can take the valuation of a site like that. But the other consequence of citywide upzoning is that you allow all of the increase in land value to basically be suppressed. You're not sort of spurring, as we often see when we do a strip, like a corridor gets rezoned. Now all of a sudden the only thing that you can justify building on that site is building to a closer to its max. Minneapolis saw this, that the actual land value across the city didn't increase all that much, just people's options to do more with it did. But the financing of a fourplex, the construction costs, on a per square foot basis might be a little bit higher. So we have one of our leaders of Strongtown's Buffalo, her name is Bernice Radel. She's with the Neighborhood Evolution organization as well. She was having a conversation last week with her banker. And her banker said, in your pro forma, your per square foot costs are higher than I normally see. She said, yeah, that's because I'm selling smaller units. But my actual cash flow, or not just cash flow, but my per square foot sales price is also higher. And so small will come with some trade-offs, but the idea of absolute efficiency, well, then you should build warehouses or build large-scale properties. Instead, what you can get down to is on a simple lot like that, your lot assembly time, you're not paying extra fees for that. You're working much more integrated on a single site, site prep, all of those different types of things. And especially if you can integrate parking into it in a way that is using a side lane for four spaces per unit, or, well, 4 spaces per unit. Some might want 4 spaces per unit, more likely a unit per space. Space per unit, there we go. Yeah, but we certainly, the other thing is Los Angeles, not a good example in South Dakota, I know, but Los Angeles, they found that once there was a pathway to getting loans for accessory dwelling units, and there were companies that said, hey, we will drop a backyard cottage into any property, all of a sudden the uptick, they have added, I don't want to misrepresent the numbers, but it's a substantial amount of new homes, and they're all backyard cottages. I think the largest percentage of new home construction in the city of Los Angeles is actually in backyards. It's not your sixplexes or six-story structures, that sort of stuff. And as I think about rural communities or somewhat urbanized communities, that's the kind of construction that we need, is the small scale, integrated into neighborhood construction in our places. So we often will do that where we race out and we're like, all right, if every lot had every backyard filled, yeah, you would have capacity problems. But already if we take that our occupancy is lower, our per lot occupancy, per home occupancy numbers are lower than they used to be. It would suggest that the impact of any given household is actually going to be smaller than what you would have previously. So what our neighborhoods were designed for always had spare capacity, and the gradual process of redevelopment also creates the necessary tax base, especially in California, because of Prop 13 and efforts to suppress property taxes. That's the opportunity there that they have to actually see now a new tax windfall come from the new participation on that block. And so what you need to create are additional participants, sort of that image I showed of all of the different participants in the Homer Simpson Plaza. Like, that's how you get to the point where you can actually afford to replace the infrastructure. The other realization or reality is like the infrastructure that exists in existing neighborhoods does need to be kept up. Not just kept maintained, but over time replaced. And so the redevelopment cycle is part of our expectation of how we cover that work of making it happen, because it isn't the newcomers that have worn out the pipes, and it's not the newcomers that have created the conditions which maybe the electrical load is under strain. It's people who've lived there for a long time and not actually had to bear the cost of preparing for the replacement of those items. Their property costs have been lower than they otherwise might be in order to cover not just the upfront cost of the deployment of the infrastructure, but its gradual maintenance and then replacement over time. And so I understand the other element is that like the gradual redeployment of our neighborhoods should come with infrastructure renewal. LA is so deeply indebted that they're not doing anywhere close to the replacements that they would do whether or not the accessory dwelling units were being added to the neighborhood. You will find leaking pipes in places that haven't seen new housing in a long time. You will see broken systems. You will see potholes in places that have not had a new home anywhere near them. And so the potholes, the broken pipes, the failing infrastructure is not the consequence of the new arrival. It's sort of like blaming, you're down 15-1 in your softball game and somebody shows up from work and then they get the blame because your team is losing. That's the challenge that we face for ourselves. So I hear you, but there's my quick response is often like, let's get specific to that block. What is it that the new entrant has caused compared to the long-term occupants that have been there and perhaps worn down that infrastructure to the point that it does need to be replaced, and now they're blaming the newcomer because the replacement is having to happen. I don't think it accelerates aging is the other key thing as well. I would also say that probably the deployment of electric vehicles is having more of a strain on our grid than the introduction of new homes, just in terms of this loading of systems on the electrical side. Yeah. So stormwater, this is one of those ones where the same amount of rain falls on a one-story building, a two-story building, or a three-story building. But the potential tax return to a community is significantly more in that three-story building than the one-story building. So we know that we have a multiplication effect when we can start to thicken up vertically and begin to help ourselves in that way. Stormwater is a huge burden. It also can be addressed through things like porous surfaces, so making sure that driveways, if they are required, are not allowed to simply be poured, but should make some consideration for how do you recharge the groundwater, how do you make sure that downspouts are being properly drained, creating conditions, incentives for things like rain gardens, so that way you pre-treat or pre-hold water on site. And oftentimes it's, well, on a single lot with one house, there's a large, sprawling lawn, and so that's going to hold the water. And if we put any more homes on there, then we have this stormwater problem. But that's actually not the case. If we look at the vast majority of our communities, The thing that causes the most holding of stormwater and us having to deal with it is our streets. And so if our streets are so low performance, they're not actually well populated, but we have to cover all of the costs of their stormwater holding and all of the water that courses through our system in floods times as well as not, then adding more participants to at least cover the cost of that stormwater is going to have a significant role. The other element is our fixation on, well, no, it's not so much fixation, but on single detached housing is a known financial commodity. It's a very, you go to the bank, you say, I just want a house, there's no shared wall, so there's no problem. You can get lending, and we have a cultural attachment to it as well, which emerges almost in a farcical way where you will have homes that seem like they are like a postage stamp apart from each other. From a fire, which is like, hey, at least I own it outright, because then I don't have to deal with a common wall agreement. But if past behavior tells us anything, it was that we were very comfortable throughout American history with common wall agreements in most of our downtown areas. As we developed our communities, we would build next to each other and share a wall. And over time, building standards have improved, and now we have that firewall. So you have your brick there. Instead of cheap vinyl siding, you've got a proper firewall. So the risk of buildings that are close together is actually amplified by our insistence that we continue to detach everything, rather than allowing them to actually share walls and benefit from a proper firewall treatment. And the consequence of that is that then your townhome structures are significantly, I'm not going to say they're exceptionally overperforming our single detached neighborhoods, but we see in fire responses that the vast majority of calls are still going out to single family neighborhoods. Partly because we have a lot of them, but also because you're distributing your network, you're creating the conditions in which the fire engine is having to respond at some distance from a nearby fire station because you don't have the requisite property base to be able to pay for additional fire service. So in Queens, New York, which again, this is not Queens or anywhere near it, Queens, New York has some of the best response times to structure fires across North America, because they can afford to have lots of fire stations because they have a sufficient base from which to cover the costs for that. And then the last element of it is we see in our suburban standards that we've tried to thread that needle where developers are saying, well, I bought the land and it was more expensive than it used to be, so now I'm going to put a lot more homes on it, but I'm going to make sure they're all detached because that's what the market allows. That's what the city planner says, oh, it's a single family neighborhood? Sure, go for it. The moment you say, but we're also doing townhomes, whoa, that'll be a special area. We're gonna have to do a special planned unit development on that. Don't spook us, like we don't want your ideas here. That can be that challenge. So stormwater, more participants cover the cost because stormwater is exceptionally expensive. I was driving through and I was looking up, when did this area last flood? Because I could see the evidence still in the landscape of serious flooding that's occurred. That is a challenge that needs to be grappled with in all of our places, and we lack the resources to be able to deal with that in our current state. So.